Here on Much Music would be Dave Bidini, of course, from the Real Statics, and also author, not a first-time published author, because two times. This came out in October on A Cold Road. Now, I like this book because I think you can, and anybody can get into it on, I think, 3 different levels. One of them being just being a fan of Canada, to read about Canada because you've traveled across Canada touring with the Real Statics. Maybe a fan of the band Real Statics because it's the Real Statics tour, and also a fan of Canadian history in terms of rock and roll.
Cultural history.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's three different areas you're hitting.
Well, so,
was that the intent?
Oh, it has. I think that's one of the experiences as a musician. Like somebody says in that book, they found out way more about Canada than they ever wanted to know by traveling back and forth. Like you really find out all the small towns and all the people in those places. But I've been getting letters from people like, you know, in Saskatchewan and out east and stuff. Because more often than not, their towns just aren't written about. They're not mentioned in, you know, well, I mean, maybe in like some Canadian literature, but that experience of like rock and roll in small town Canada has never really been articulated or dignified or whatever. So that's pretty cool, getting feedback from people across the country.
I didn't know that there was a Melville, even.
There's a Melville up here and there's a Melville out there.
Now, what was the intent when you first put the pen to paper or started work on your computer? And was the intent realized by the time you finished?
Yeah, I think so.
What did you plan on doing with it?
I just wanted to like illuminate the experience of a touring musician in Canada, because we know a lot about. Well, we don't know a lot about what it's really like to go out there and play in the bars and play in the clubs and I think like musicians, the musician's experience. It's not really one that we talk about often. It's I think music in Canada is often taken for granted by Canadians and for whatever reason. So I just wanted to kind of like illuminate that experience and really like people would get a sense of what it's like to be a troubadour in Canada and to be out there playing, sharing the experience with fans and stuff. Because more than ever, I think people are interested in music and Canadian music and stuff. So
the style of the book I think is very interesting in that you draw parallels from the Real Statics tour with the Hip when you opened up the Cross Canada tour a couple of years ago. Your experiences and experiences with bands throughout Canadian history.
Yeah.
And so it's not just a Real Statics book, it's a Canadian rock and roll history book.
I wanted to meet all those old freaks that I used to listen to in the 70s whose songs were on K-Tel albums and stuff. And all those bands used to come to my high school and play, like Gatto and Rush and Max Webster. And they're great storytellers, Bob Segarini, people like that, Rick Emmett. And it's true, great songwriters and great musicians, but amazing storytellers, man. So, and as soon as I started talking to these people, I knew that it was going to be a pretty fun book, because I knew they had crazy stories. Sex and drugs and rock and roll and van, near-death experiences, and out in the wintertime, and, bad gigs, great gigs, worst groupies, best groupies. And we don't have a lot of that in our personal experiences. So it was nice to get...
Right.
No. So it was nice to get to
hear it from someone else, to hear their stories.
But it was a shared experience. Like, they were telling stories that I could totally relate to. You know, just that loneliness and solitude about being out on the road from one town to another, terrible snowstorms, terrible blizzards, and sticking together and trying to get through it and trying to, maintain a kind of mental balance and also sharing the experience with your bandmates and stuff, so.
Well, any band starting out at this point or anybody who wants to break into this business, I wouldn't wish my worst enemy what some people have to get through to make it. Because you have to persevere. It is a tough business.
A lot of bands get spat out.
Particularly young Canadian bands looking to make it, though. What sort of challenges face Canadian artists that maybe wouldn't in the U.S.?
It's a crazy country to navigate. I mean, anyone who's driven any part of the nation in the winter, in the spring, and the fall even, it's a tough place to get around. The landscape is so rugged. But I think it's important, well, first of all, to understand, people who live on, either side of you, people who, to the province to your right and the province to your left. But also, doing a few Canadian tours totally toughens you for touring the rest of the world. Like, I think if you can navigate Canada, if you can go east to west, come back intact, survive, and build on that, then going and play in Europe or the States is pretty easy because there aren't those geographical, obstacles, really, so much in other countries and stuff. Totally builds character. It does. Rock and roll builds character.
So this is almost a handbook, then, for a band starting out, maybe looking to tour Canada. Read this book.
It's kind of what to do and what not to do.
That's true.
Learn from my mistakes, please. I beg of you. But hopefully people, I mean, I've got letters from, like, old folks who haven't picked up their guitar and young kids who are starting band, and they're getting inspired from the book and from all the stories that I tell and from the stories that the other people tell. So maybe bands will be born from this book, and I think that would be a beautiful thing.
Well, Real Statics have always used Canadian Anna as a reference to write songs. Two that come to mind, Wendell Clark, maybe the Group of Seven,
yeah.
Canadian things made famous in Real Statics songs. Some say that our history is boring compared to the U.S. I would think you would vehemently disagree with that.
Well, there's some pretty exotic stories there, and well, I just think maybe people think it's boring because people don't know about it, really. So, but there's a great wealth. I mean, people have been playing music in Canada since the early 50s, so there's bound to be thousands and thousands of stories that are absolutely as exotic, as compelling, as intriguing, as strange and beautiful as stories from other countries. But the great thing about it is that these stories are our own. Just like, you know, a tale of an Irish rock band would be, you know, unique to Ireland. It's the same thing in Canada, any other country, and I think that's the beauty. I think that's something worth celebrating and talking about. And people will know a bit more about that rock and roll culture with books like this, and with like bands defining it and articulating it. You know, bands that are going today. You know, the Tragically Hip on tour, stuff like that. You know, they're writing about the experience just as much as I'm writing about it in this book. So
you've heard the theory that Canada's history is boring, I guess.
First time, Bill.
No.
No.
Really?
Well, it was never boring to me.
It's part of the whole Canadian psyche in that we are, maybe some of us anyway, a bit, you know, because we do live next to the U.S., so we are kind of have this inferiority complex or something.
Yeah, but I think for us, we're not always out there, you know, trumpeting that experience, and I think because it's so dear and unique to what we go through, and because we hold it, and because there's so little. It's such a broad country with so many different types of people in so many different regions. It's really hard to put it down in an epithet exactly what Canada is. So it's always an elusive search. But that search can be totally compelling. And for us, I think as a band and as lyricists and as songwriting, it's that constant pursuit of trying to sort of put into words and music our experiences. And those experiences happen to be Canadian. And because they're my experiences, I think they're beautiful. So I think we should probably stop worrying about maybe what other people think about it and just start loving what we do.
Okay, got to let you know, February 15th through to the 20th, Real Statics at
with
Ted's
the Weaker
Wrecking
Thans
Yard
from Winnipeg.
Here in Toronto on College.
Yeah.
And now, do you want to sign this? Actually,
okay, right on the
here,
air, so
right
people know. It wasn't you forging my signature.
And what's going to happen is we're going to give 2 of these away, 1-800-265, much is the number. Tell us what band Real Statics toured with 2 years ago right across Canada, and we'll randomly draw 2 winners.
I think you should sign this too, Bill.
No, it's here. I didn't write it.
Right.
Stolen Car, Real Statics here on Much.
The roadies, the groupies, the parties backstage, and the trashed hotel rooms. The road trip. It's part of the legend of rock and roll.
Now, Dave Bidini of the group The Real Statics has written a book chronicling the adventures of Canadian rock bands on tour. It's called On a Cold Road. Tonight on Gregg & Company, contributing editor Alan Gregg in conversation with Dave Bidini.
Your new book is not only a diary of your touring with the Tragically Hip, it's also chock full of anecdotes of artists, Canadian artists who blazed the trail in the 60s and 70s. Talking to these people, I mean, what struck you as the greatest contrast between the life Canadian musicians lived at that point in time versus today?
Way more sex, way more drugs. They seem to occupy this kind of forbidden strata in society now. I mean, musicians are integral parts of our communities. and back then it seemed they'd ripped it up a lot more. They were bad boys, kind of, and nasty girls. And, you know, I know, like, because when I went to sit down to write, like, our story and stuff, I felt a little like, this book will never sell because there's no, you know,
sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
Yeah, we never had any wild stories. So thank God, like, somebody like Greg Godovitz existed who had, you know, whatever, has lived multiple lifetimes in terms of that kind of lifestyle.
Well, it begs the question, what happened in the ensuing 20 years?
Well,
what happened to the sex, drugs, and rock and roll?
Well, I mean, there's this little thing probably called AIDS that had something to do with it, I think. So there was less rampant, unprotected, that kind of thing. And I think, I know when we came up in the late 70s and 80s, kind of out of new wave and punk rock, by being a straight-ahead-ish band, we were kind of reacting against you know, if you think of our musical forefathers being like our parents, we wanted to be unlike them, and very sober-minded, and yeah, just being a little more conscious that we were out there to deliver music, and that that other stuff might, in fact, take away from that experience, that personal experience and the artistic experience. So I think in that sense, we just didn't want to be like them, and we weren't like them.
Now, the modern musician obviously tours, but not like these guys. These bands would go across the country, you know, for 20 years, playing every out-of-the-way, you know, bunghole in the country. Did you get a sense of what that life must have been like talking to these guys?
Yeah, and, you know, it's almost like some of the stuff was like a Fassbinder film, you know, like really dirty, awful, heathen places, you know, and fights and riots and local characters and knife fights and stabbings and you know, corrupt promoters. Well, there's still corrupt promoters, but really, you know, a series of you know, like plummeting, really getting deeper and deeper into a kind of culture that I don't think exists so much these days. So, like, they would tell stories about, like, just bar fights. There are no good bar fights anymore.
No, you don't see them?
No.
But in fact, there's stories that one of the reasons that David Clayton Thomas and Ronnie Hawkins were able to rise up out of the Canadian scene is that because they were both big guys who could jump right in there and duke it out.
Sure, tough, yeah, totally. I mean, like Jack Pedler would tell, he was in original drummer in Teenage Head, but he was in tons of bands in Hamilton and stuff. He'd say, like, he'd show up at, they'd put the band up in a hotel in the club where it'd be playing in North Bay, and there'd be like a snowbank in their room and stuff, because the room wouldn't have a window. And, you know, about getting, you know, threatened at knife point, guys outside the back of the club wanted to steal their band shirts and stuff like that. And playing in northern British Columbia, where the club was so bad that when there was a big fight in the bar, the cops wouldn't even go down the street to the bar. And I think John Cody tells a story about the lead singer getting clopped in the head by a 26er and bleeding profusely on the stage, and they're trying to drag him out, and the audience is blocking them, yelling, "One more song, one more song." And the ambulance wouldn't even come down to get these guys. So it's weird. So there's fewer places like that, and that might in fact be a good thing, if those were the kind of joints that bands played. Yet at the same time, there are just less opportunities, I think, for musicians to go to these places.
Well, and that's the other side, is that while that, you know, the specifics of those experiences might seem awful, I mean, the fact of the matter is that those bands had places to play.
Yeah, for
and
sure.
they had careers without big record deals. I mean, today, I mean, because the modern musician want to get out on the road that way?
I don't.
Is the notion of touring for 20 years appealing to your generation?
I think there are bands that definitely love to tour. And, you know, when you're 19, 20, 21, 22, it doesn't matter. You'll tour to the end of time. Because you really don't know any better, and you haven't reached your limit, your psychological limit, I don't think, yet. But I think, you know, a lot of these small towns just don't have live musical venues anymore because they turn on the television and there's ostensibly a live band, you know, there's a band doing their thing, they get it all the time.
With music video, you're talking.
Yeah, much music on the internet and stuff like that. So, but at the same time, a lot of the people in those towns, a lot of the kids, I think, are a lot more sophisticated, and their tastes are a little more broad than they might have been 20 years ago. And they buy records through mail order and through the internet and stuff, and they'll travel 7 hours to Winnipeg to see a weird band come up from Minneapolis or a band come over from the Maritimes to play and stuff.
Right.
So it's a trade-off for sure.
The thread that runs through this book is your touring with the Tragically Hip on their Trouble at the Hen House tour. And playing an opening slot is a unique experience for a musician, too.
Yes.
I mean, what is that like, going in front of someone else's audience? In this instance, in big arenas.
Well, it's, I mean, one of the things I say in there is that you always dream of playing hockey rinks when you're a kid. You just never dream you're the opening band.
Right.
Because you can never prepare for that. I mean, you walk out on stage and there's, you know, whatever, 6,000 people in a 16,000 seat arena. It's basically, and you're basically playing music for people that sort of take their seats to. And that can be a little disconcerting, you know, at times. And it's the first couple experiences for us were totally harrowing. We had no idea what it was going to be like. And you out there, you're giving it your best, and you really, it's like any concert experience. You just have to hope that, you know, there are 20 people out there that are just potentially really getting into it. And the only, it's funny because you're on that stage and it's so high, you've never been on a stage higher before, and your voice has never sounded larger. So that's a tough thing as well. You're only out there for 25 minutes, so you're just by the end of the set, you're getting used to how your voice sounds out of the giant speakers and how to manipulate it and how to really make it sound good. But really, the only people you see are like the 25 people who are sitting in front of you and stuff. So you try to make eye contact with them, and then it's over. And it's hard, man. You can never really achieve sonic climax. It's really hard to do that in such a short set and stuff. So it's a bit tough.
Well, I mean, you toured with the Hip, and they're phenomenal. Their success really is phenomenal. I mean, people from outside the country come and see what they're doing. Here, I mean, you've seen the audience reaction too. I mean, is it their Canadianness that in large part is responsible for that success?
I'm sure it is. I mean, I remember going to Ireland. I went to school there in '85 at Trinity, and man, there was like thousands of bands, well, not thousands, but hundreds of bands, folk singers and rock bands that I'd never heard of, but who were huge in Ireland. It's almost the Quebecois model, you know, just people you don't hear of outside those borders, and were loved. And someone like Christy Moore, loved because he sang about Ireland. He was eloquent and poeticized Ireland. And just realizing that there was something really beautiful about that. And it didn't matter to the Irish, really, that these people weren't successful exports, or that Christy Moore didn't, you know, tour and play thousands of people in America.
They weren't fixated on that.
Yeah, it didn't matter. And it shouldn't really, I've always thought that it shouldn't matter whether Canadian bands are successful in America or the UK. It should matter whether Canadian bands are successful in Canada. Because these are our people, you know, these are our artists, and it's important for them to be articulating the experience and stuff.
What's the deal with the hockey? You guys are all hockey maniacs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, what's not the deal? I mean, I think geez. Yeah, well, on that tour with the Hip, there they rented. That's one of the great perks of being a. I mean, I think they use their rock stardom for good rather than evil. And I mean, in the sense of like when they're on the road, they don't throw lavish parties in penthouses in hotels. They like rent ice time at like the local rink and have the sporting goods supply store give everybody skates and gear and stuff. So they love the game, and we love to play as well. And I got a chance to stop Glenn Gretzky on a breakaway.
And you tell the story.
Yeah.
But there is, I mean, there's a whole hockey league full of Canadian musicians.
Yeah, there are.
That play regularly.
Yeah, there's a good team and a bad team, a friendly team and an evil team. I play on the friendly team.
Yeah,
the Morning Stars, the White Knights.
We won't talk about the suspensions. That's secrets.
That's right.
On the other side, I mean, you touched on the Canadianness and how that probably does have an appeal with the audience. I mean, someone else we're looking at now, the Bare Naked Ladies, who had tremendous success in Canada. It looked like it was petering out.
Yeah.
And now are exploding in America, in no small measure by virtue of touring that country in an unrelenting fashion. I mean, what signal, if any, does that send back to Canadian musicians and Canadian bands, the Bare Naked Ladies' success? Yeah,
well, it's always hard to, I mean, the stories that you're going to read about them are going to basically, you know, I think focus on their pop success over the last year or whatever. But, you know, I think it gets back to the fact that they, you know, when Gordon came out, they toured.
This is their first commercial record.
That's right. They toured across the country, and they played everywhere, man. They went up to Baffin Island.
Oh, yeah.
And to St. John's and out to Victoria, and they did the country like exhaustively. And they did that a couple of times too. So I mean, I know talking to those guys, like for them, touring the States was kind of easy. I mean, they worked 2 years solidly away from their families, so they really gave up a lot to get what they've been getting lately. But you know, an hour and a half between towns and stuff, and they could go and micro market and go to towns and keep repeating, because it was relatively easy compared to driving those great distances.
Right.
So I think you can go back and talk about the band and stuff. It thickened, you know, their spirit. You know, coming out of this country and being able to go to these other places where it wasn't that hard to do.
But I'm wondering, I mean, what does that say to you? Is that kind of a big deal? Does that say, oh, geez, if the Rio Statics went down there, you know, and worked that hard again, they could bust America? Because there is a fixation with America for the Canadian bands.
Yeah, there is, yeah. But there's so many bands. There's millions of bands in the United States. I mean, the Bare Naked Ladies went down there and played for 2 years and then became, you know, a #1 band. Tragically Hip have gone down there for many years and can't get arrested in a lot of the towns. So there's no formula. You can't plug it in. And to believe that you can go down there and achieve success just by being a good band is a lie. And I think it doesn't necessarily just apply in the States. It applies anywhere. Right. You really have to go down and know exactly what you want to be and what you want to do. And I think you have to trade off a part of your life in order to achieve that success.
Right.
And if you're a band that, well,
I mean, it's different for every band. Every band should know their own, have an idea of what their career model is.
Well, let's talk about you for a while, because I mean, the Rheostatics had a big deal with Sire Records, Seymour Stein, I mean, the bigs,
Seymour.
And you're making albums, dedicated to, inspired by the art of the Group of Seven.
Right.
More recent one, kind of dedicated to a CBC radio show. You got a children's one.
Yes.
Anywhere. A Canadian film score.
Right.
This hardly sounds like some guys who are, relentlessly pursuing commercial success. I mean, is there an active attempt to avoid it?
No, it was an active attempt to be commercial success. That's always been our formula. And whenever we've gone in the studio, we've thought, man, we got a great set of pop songs here. Boy, we got some great hooks, some melodies that are just going to kill. We can hear this in a shopping mall. And then we go in and just the records end up being the other end of that. They just end up being too weird for their own good often. But I don't know. No, I think we go in there thinking that we have, and we do think we have universally hummable melodies and sophisticated songs that should be played on, in a perfect world, should be played on the radio. But they're not for whatever reason. So, we also, part of, we think a project ourselves, like music inspired by the Group of Seven, is in fact a very exotic project, but we see African bands come up here all the time, and klezmer bands and bands from other cultures, and we see our music almost as like world beat to the rest of the world. I mean, it's distinctly Canadian and exotic in its own way. And I think that's one of the things that we always believed in too, that Canadian music, I think for a while had a rap of being kind of, plaid jackets and BTO and that kind of thing.
Right.
But in fact, some Canadian music is the most exotic music being made on the continent.
You got a children's record coming up. What's next for Dave Bidini?
Well, I'm going to go...